guys and gals, and welcome to another video from the team here at BlenderTech.com. If you enjoyed or learned something from the video, consider liking it and consider subscribing for more Blender, Unity 3D coding, and all sorts of other CG related videos. Lastly, don't forget our motto, create your way. So in still working with the user Kaid, I still don't know the pronunciation 100%. We found out that his problem is he's learning to and trying to figure out how to unwrap complex shapes. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some shapes of different sizes, not just a standard cube, and I'm going to show how unwrapping them in different ways will affect the way your texture displays, how to use the Blender's texture grid overlay to get a preview of how your textures will work and how your unwrap is looking, and also how to unwrap complicated objects. So other people, even apart from the user I'm helping out here, will probably learn some things here if you're having problems unwrapping complex objects, or if you just want to learn a little bit more about UV unwrapping in general. So I'm first going to show what everyone should be aware of, the ability for Blender to overlay a preview grid over your unwrapped objects. So I'm going to split my window here with just the default cube so far. I'm just going to start with this just to show it off. We're going to go into the UV image editor, obviously, and I'm going to unwrap this cube, and instead of adding seams, I'm just going to do a smart UV unwrap to do it quickly. So we have our cube unwrapped here, obviously, and so what you can do is in the UV editor, go to Image, New Image, and then you don't really have to name it. You could just call it, say, Test Grid or something. Again, the size doesn't really matter. But under Generated Type, instead of the usual stuff options, just choose Color Grid. And then hit OK, and so you'll see what that's done is it's created a grid with grid numbers and letters, so that A1, A2, A3, B1, B2, B3, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this allows you to see how your object will be unwrapped and how your texture will kind of look over it. So this will allow you to minimize stretching on objects. So let me just show you what this will look like now. So as you might assume, all we need to do is add a stock material and then change the color to an image texture, and then just open up the test grid that it generated. And then if we go into material mode, or I think even texture mode might even work. Yeah, whatever you prefer, you can see how it shows how everything lines up. So using the grid lines, for example, you can see that we would have no texture stretching in this instance because everything lines up very well, perfectly in all instances. However, if we go to this side, right along, I don't even know what this is, I guess it'd be D3, D4, D5, E, D, so that would be, so it'd be C3 and D3. So that shows you how your texture would not line up perfectly, however, because our grid lines don't line up on this side. So how you might fix that is, you would take part of your image and you would fix it up. So we're looking at, what was it, C3? So you would take face select, for example, and then grab that particular face, this one, and then you would move it until it lines up perfectly. So it would need to be something, it would depend on your texture, of course, but something along the lines of, I'll hold down shift for a bit more precision, something along the lines of that. So now we have that aligned more so. Now there's texture overlap, so this might not apply to every texture, but that just kind of shows you how the system works. So these three sides line up. Let's see how it looks on this side. Okay, so we have one more face that isn't good, so we need to go back into face select mode, find that edge, or that face, sorry, and do the same thing. Control L to grab just grab the whole face and hit G to grab, and then you want to line up your texture. Again, I'm not going for perfection in terms of the numbers and letters, just getting the grid lined up. Something like that. So those line up now, and the bottom's off. So again, we'd go into face mode, we'd select the bottom, which happens to be this one. We should be able to put it right beside this one and it will line up, or possibly not. Beside that one and over a little, I would think. So not the best example, because obviously we have texture overlapping, but that just shows you how the color grid can help you to align your textures before you or to align your UV layout before you actually go and export it, so that you know you won't get any stretching and whatever. And I omitted this when we did our concrete block example because it's a pain in the butt, but it can definitely save you some hassles in the end. And if you want a perfectly textured item, this is definitely the way to go. Another thing you can do is under new image, you can choose UV grid, and that gives you just colored black and white squares with these colored what would you call them, crosshairs on them. And I find this can sometimes be a bit easier than the numbers and letters one. Let's choose it here. So basically all you have to do is get everything lined up so that the black and white squares all line up, and that will ensure you have no stretching and everything lines up basically. So we have these available to us, the UV grid and the color grid, so maybe we will be using them, but let's start with some shapes to unwrap to start figuring out how textures are going to be affected by different shapes and how to unwrap different shapes. So I'm going to start with something simple. A cube obviously anybody can do, but let's start with a cylinder. So in this case, we could do a smart UV unwrap, but what I might do in this instance is we'll tab into edit mode. We will we'll select an edge here, and we will mark it as a seam. So Control E to bring up your edge menu, and mark seam. And we'll open up our UV/image editor again. And at all points, I'm always testing how my unwrap is looking. So at this point I would go U unwrap, and obviously it's not going to do anything like that. So I want to select the top loop by holding Alt and right clicking on it, and then hit Control E and mark seam. Select all, U unwrap. See how that's looking? Alright, we're getting somewhere. So clearly this is unwrapped perfectly, but you can see that our fan is looking kind of not so good. So maybe we need to add a seam to the bottom, just like the top. So we'll do the same thing. Alt right click on the bottom circle loop, Control E, mark seam, unwrap everything again. So now what we have is the top and bottom, and we have all the sides perfectly straight up and down as far as we can tell. And there are ways to double check. Whoops. To double check that everything is perfectly straight. That is not what I want. This one. If you go into vertex select mode down here, and then instead of increment snapping, change it to vertex snapping. When you grab a vertex and hit G to grab to move it, you can now snap it to another vertex. And so if I hit G and then X, so that's left and right only, and then move my mouse down to this vertex and hold down Control, it'll snap to that vertex and only the x-axis, so you'll know if it's aligned horizontally or not. And you'll see we have a value of 0.0000 repeating, so that means it's perfectly aligned horizontally. And we would do this. We would do the same vertically. So we'd go G, Y, and so you see we get up and down, and we choose a point that we want to use as our base point. So In this case, I would use one like this beside it maybe and hit Control, and you can see we have the same values, so that means it's perfectly aligned. And so that's one of the base ways to make sure everything is perfectly straight. So this way a flat texture applied to this is not going to be stretched at all. And when it comes to doing circular objects like this, obviously if you try to overlay a flat texture on top of that, it's going to stretch it in and make it look all weird. So you would want your texture to obviously accommodate that. However, you could also take your circle, and you could align everything so that everything's in a perfect square. And then you could apply a square texture to it and you would get a different kind of look to it. But I'll go into that more here. I'm just trying to decide how I'm gonna go about this whole little tutorial. Let's maybe first let's bring up our grids and let's see what it looks like. So I am going to set an image texture. I'm going to use the UV grid. I tend to use that more often than not. And we'll go into material mode. And so you can see that the sides are all lined up perfectly all the way around. There's no stretching and they line up perfectly. But the top and the bottom don't line up at all. So what you might want to do in this instance is grab your UV top, I believe that one is. Let's see here. If I grab the top face, oh, it's the one on the right. Okay, never mind. So we want to grab the one on the right. I'll grab a vertex, then hit Control L to select the entire thing. You'll see we can now move it. So you would want to maybe line it up more so that everything lines up as best as possible. So I would go something maybe like, it's not intuitive at first, but you get used to it eventually. So you're trying to get the squares all the same size and alternating. Now I'm overlapping, so I'd go something over here. It's pretty close. I'm just going to grab it along the X to bring it up and down. I'm basing everything off of this square right here right now. Then may grab it along the Y and make some small adjustments, holding shift for more accuracy. So now we have that square perfectly aligned, so there would be no stretching if we were to overlay an entire texture over the whole thing at this point. There'd be no texture stretching or alignment issues in most of these parts. Again, you'd have to do some more alignment. It's not perfect here, but that gives you a general idea. You can see that some of them line up, some of them don't. So that's where you might need to take individual vertices, and then you can move them manually, and you can get everything lined up. And it could be a very tedious process, but in the end it can leave you with a perfect result if that's what you're looking for, if you're applying one whole texture over the entire thing. But let's undo what we did there. Let's see what putting a whole texture over this entire thing looks like. Let's export this UV layout. Just call this cylinder. And I'm just going to open up Photoshop. So I've got this sci-fi floor texture. I think that will show stretching and such quite well. So I'm going to select it all, and copy it and paste it onto the texture, the UV map here. So let's just leave it like that and see what it looks like. So I'm gonna undo the UV layout, and I'm gonna resave this right over top of it. And then I'm obviously going to use that as the texture. I'll only do this the first, so I'm not going to repeat myself over and over and over again. So we're going to change this to that we just created. So you can see that the sides work out completely fine. They look like they're textured perfectly. But again, when we get to the top, things don't line up so well. So this would be the perfect case where if you're using a texture like that, you would need to go in and edit each point manually. We're working from this side. Okay, I see. And you can obviously try to get things lined up or unstretched as much as possible with some work. But generally what you want to be doing when you're unwrapping objects like this is to have, I'll control L to grab the entire thing, is to have everything separate, so each face a separate part, and then when you're going to actually texture it, to have a separate texture for each part of the object. So that obviously is the standard way to texture something. Obviously, if you're not aware, if you are though, however, we'll move on to the next steps. So let's get rid of our cylinder and see how a sphere works. So we've got a sphere. I'm going to tab into edit mode and I'm going to just select it, turn off perspective. I'm going to select the center ring in vertex or edge selection mode, holding down Alt and right click, and I'm going to go Control E and mark as a seam. I'm going to see how it looks, unwrap. So we have a perfectly unwrapped texture more or less. However, we would get stretching to a certain degree because of the way it's unwrapped it perfectly flat. Obviously you can change this if you wanted the top to be a separate piece. For example, you could select that and mark that as a seam, re-unwrap, and then it's going to be a completely separate part that you can texture separately compared to the rest of it. So depending on the amount of polygons, you could obviously do that for each loop or whatever parts of your object. But forgetting that, let's export this out as sphere, and let's see how it looks the same way. So if I just overlay a plain old texture over it, let's see what happens. So as you can see, it unwraps pretty perfectly on the top and bottom. There's a little bit of stretching, but there's the obvious seam line. Now that can be fixed a few ways. You can do texture painting. You could take, for example, this entire piece and you could rotate it and try to line up parts of your texture if it's tileable in that way. Again, it's completely independent of your texture. As you can see, there's really nothing that would be perfect as far as I can tell. We could try a whole rotation to see. Something like that is about as close as we're gonna get, really. But let's see the difference, however, when we texture each part of it separately. So this time we've got a separate texture, well, the same texture, but either way, a separate texture for each side of it. And this isn't a good example because they're right on top of each other. I should have moved them separately, but I've tried to align it as perfectly as I can. So let's see what that does. So I'm just going to open the sphere. I'm going to go image, reload image, and you can see we have a much nicer looking UV unwrap, in my opinion. Again, it depends on the texture, but you can see for the most part everything lines up. Did I leave the UVs on? I left the UVs on. Let me fix it. So there we have it. Just move it above the grid floor. I could turn the grid floor off all the way, but you can see we have a lot less of a seam visible in most parts. And again, we could still go and edit where our like we could still do the little rotation bit and try to get things more lined up. But since the texture was basically lined up in Photoshop, we shouldn't have to do too much, but as you can see, there's still some places that we would want to fix with, say, some texture painting or whatever. But you can see how that definitely textures it a lot better, and from a distance it would obviously you wouldn't notice the seam, whereas on the other one you would definitely notice the seam. So just shows you how texturing different parts of each mesh separately can definitely make it look a lot better. So let's unwrap a complex object, though, not just these primitives. So I'm just going to create something quickly and we'll go over a few things. So we have just some weird object here. It's fairly primitive, but it might be not intermediate, but definitely harder than a cube and simple cylinder to unwrap. So how might we unwrap this? Well, what I do when I'm modeling a mesh that's one whole object like this, instead of just doing a cube and 3 separate cylinders, it's one single mesh of them all combined. I've made them all separate objects. So if I select a vertex on the cube and hit Control L for length, I only get the cube, and the same for everything else. So they're all separate objects. So that's what I recommend you do when it comes to creating complex objects. And this can't always be achieved, but it definitely makes it a lot easier. So basically we would just unwrap everything as separate objects. And this is kind of the idea of a texture island. So yeah, we'll just unwrap them as usual. We'll grab our cube and set some seams, and I continually test it out. Alright, so our cube's looking good. Let's get to the cylinders. Let's see how that looks. Alright, we're getting somewhere, but the sides are they're these fans that come to this weird kind of look. And if that's the way you want to unwrap it, it could definitely work. And if you wanted to, say, fix the rotation issue, all you'd have to do is select all the interior points and just rotate them the needed degrees to line everything up. But I'm going to unwrap this as you normally would, so I'm just going to grab an edge on each. And unwrap. So we now have, obviously, our cube, and we have the sides of all of our cylinders. And we have the tops of our cylinders, obviously the bigger one, the smaller one, and such. So the cube I'm going to leave as it is. This is something that you can also use in your unwraps. We know the top and bottom of the cylinder will probably be exactly the same, so what you can do is take one of them and just grab it and fit it in somewhere, take the other one and grab it in and fit it in somewhere, and get it nice and close, and then use the vertex snapping and snap one of the points right to its twin. So I'm going to grab it and hold down Control and snap it right there. Now any texture we overlay on top of this one will be used on the top and the bottom exactly the same. So you can do that to save texture space A, and to make sure that the top and bottom are exactly alike. So I would do that also for all 4 of the smaller cylinder faces. I'm going to line them up. And then I can move them somewhere. And these are the sides of the smaller one. I'm going to separate them. So I'm going to grab this one. I should be able to hit Control L, and grab that one separately. And just move it along the X so that they're separate. And the same for this one. I'm going to separate it away from this cube here. So I'm going to grab it along the Y. I'm just going to bring it along the X so it's not quite on the edges. I'm going to grab these, move them out there a little, and the cube. I'm going to just move it out of the edges a little bit and scale it down so that it fits in there a little bit. So we've created a very, very basic texture island here, and obviously we could take these and we could scale them up, because you want to always be using the best space of your texture, of your UV island as possible. I'm going to scale that one up and fit it down there because it's obviously the bigger one. That way I'll know. And it gives more texture space. Same with these faces. Scale them up, give them more texture space. So let's see what applying some textures to this does. I'm going to export and bring it back into Photoshop. So I've gone and quickly created just this extreme red grid to see how this applies to our shape. So I'm just going to apply it to all of our faces here. Alright, so it's probably the ugliest texture in the world, but we'll see how that works. So I've had to add a off-white background of white, but as you can see, it's unwrapped itself, and of course my texture wasn't perfect, so I would need to do editing or whatever. It wasn't tileable by any means, but you can see how that works. How, for example, this face right here and this face right here are using the exact same texture space. So if I move those two faces, you can see how that adjusts them exactly the same. And the same for the top and bottom of the big cylinder, but you obviously wouldn't see that. So that's just how I would unwrap something like that, and then I would obviously go and texture each part of it independently and adjust the texture, and then maybe I would have to go in and adjust some vertexes manually in the UV/image editor to get exactly what I needed or wanted. So yeah, it takes a lot of playing around. It takes a lot of practice. It's definitely object independent, or object dependent, I guess. Sorry, and yeah, I don't know. That's the basics to it. I want to bring up the idea too of if you had multiple objects. Let me just add a cube now, and I'm gonna unwrap it separately. So we now have two unwrapped objects. So if I get rid of this image out of here for now, I have the cube unwrapped. All faces are using the entire texture space. In fact, I'm going to do a smart UV project so that we get that. And obviously this one's unwrapped that way. So we've got it that as I just showed. Now I'm going to give this one a texture. I'm going to use the exact same material. So now it's got it. It's obviously all wonky because we didn't texture it according to the faces of a cube. But what we can do is take this one's UV unwrap, and we can open up our UV unwrap shape, and we can play around with it. We could get this cube looking exactly, or this cube, sorry, looking exactly like this cube just by moving the faces around. So for example, I would grab maybe this face, and that is the top, so it was, oh geez, I don't even know which one it would be offhand. I have to look here. Well, it doesn't really matter, but the idea is you can go in and we would scale it down exactly to where it needs to be. And you can see how the top and bottom basically look exactly the same. And if I do the same for all the sides, so now you can see how I'm using the same texture we use for this object here, and I'm using the same texture space right here. However, I could have done each individual face where it would have aligned, but I didn't want to obviously spend the half hour or whatever figuring that out. So you get that effect though. But now, how would you say, if you had these two separate objects, how could we put them together on one image and say export this as one game object together while maintaining the way we have our textures set up? Well, the simple and easy answer to that is to take both objects and to join them, and we see we get no change in our texture. Just now, we if we select just these faces, you can see that they're just right there, and we could move them to different parts of the texture if we wanted, obviously. So that's one way to do it. So it goes back to the idea of having each of these objects are independent, or each of these parts of the mesh are independent objects, independent meshes, if you will, inside of the main mesh. And no matter where I move them, since I've unwrapped them separately, and it's not just one texture stretched over the entire thing, you can see how no matter where I move it, the texture stays exactly where it should. So no matter what I grab, it's going to do the same idea. Well, you get stretching there because I didn't select everything. But you get the basic idea there. No matter where I grab it, the texture is going to stay all the same no matter what I grab. So I don't know, hopefully that gives you some more insight and ideas on creating UV islands and texture islands and such. And another thing to be aware of is when you are unwrapping something, and say you have, let me create an icosphere here maybe, and unwrap it with the Smart UV project. And you can see how it's all over the place. If you wanted for some reason to have this completely straight, this is where taking individual edges and then aligning them is very important. You can there's the W key, and you can straighten them out. You can try to align auto, and you can see that gets it nice straight up and down, and then you would take the next set of edges. I'm not 100% sure if they're these in this instance, but you would do the same thing. And then you would scale everything to the same size and grab along the X, grab along the Y and snap it there, and try to get everything all scaled up exactly the same. And you would do the same for all the rings the other direction, and you would basically get a square flat projection from this icosphere. And it allows you to have different possibilities with your textures. Kind of a bad example. I don't want to go into the time of actually straightening out something like that. I suppose I could do it in time lapse. I'll show you quickly. I'll just make a new UV sphere with a low amount of rings. I'll go like say 4 rings and 8 segments maybe, and then unwrap that. Let's see what that looks like. Not the greatest example, but yeah, I could do that really quickly to show you how it works. I would do something like I don't know, something like that is the idea, and then basically you have a flat projection of 1/2 of the sphere there, and so that gives you different possibilities for texturing your objects. But yeah, this is a very basic overview still, and again, like I said, it's very object independent. Each object's going to be different and unwrapped differently. Let me see if I can find something quickly to show off. Now this is the final project of the Master It series for Blender that I purchased and taught me quite a bit about Blender ages ago. And so you get this nice looking acoustic guitar in the end, and he shows you how to model and texture and unwrap it. And so that's definitely something I would suggest if you want to learn how to unwrap things like this perfectly. And you can see not everything's perfect, but for the most part everything lines up quite nicely. You can see how everything wraps around nicely around the body, and there's no texture stretching on the front of the body, and the fret inlays aren't stretched at all, and the same with the wood texture on the headstock and the text. It's not stretched in any way, and I didn't align it perfectly along the seams here, and I would use some texture painting. Actually, let me go into that quickly. If I can handle it, this is a huge file. The textures are 6K, but if we went into if I grabbed the guitar, let's see, do I have it separated into different objects? But yeah, if I take the body here and then go into texture paint mode, my UI is completely different than I'm used to, and open up my toolbar panel. Blender has the clone brush inside of it, so what you can do is alt click somewhere. So right on this edge here, you can see we have this really bad, where's a better example? Yeah, see right here, you can see that there's an obvious seam here when you're in very, very close. So what you do is you hold control and click, and that selects a clone point, and then you just paint. Let's see here. And I want to use a texture, a new. And how I was taught to do this, the best way is to go into your brush texture, and we want clouds that are hard with a medium size and a lot of depth, and that allows you to basically fix any errors. I am not sure why it's working right now. I should be getting quite a viewable result. Alright, I guess I would have to open up a new. Well, you saw that in the how to make the concrete block video. But anyways, what I wanted to show in this file specifically was the entire object is unwrapped as one whole, it's one whole mesh that's unwrapped. So if I bring up, oh, everything's backwards compared to what I'm used to. I was doing this so long ago. If I bring up the UV image editor, you can see how it's unwrapped. And if I get rid of the actual texture, you can see how it's unwrapped. So each part is unwrapped individually. However, you can see how, what part is this here? Yeah, okay, so like the fretboard, when it was unwrapped, because you can tell that it's obviously not straight, it curves, it's not straight lines, it gets smaller from the bridge to the nut. So basically, I just created I straightened every single edge out basically for the most part, and that allowed the texture that I put over top of it to not get stretched the same way the lines stretch in. That way it stays perfectly straight. And whereas say on the back of the neck, where I left it angled so that the texture would curve around, so that it does get some stretching in certain parts where I wanted it to stretch. Where's a good example of that? Like the back right here is, I believe, one of these parts right in here, and I wanted that to stretch a little bit, so I left that mostly unstraightened. And yeah, like these are the sides of the guitar body here, so you can see how they're all completely straight along the x-axis, so that whatever texture I overlaid on it in Photoshop, excuse me, stayed perfectly aligned once I brought it into Blender. And then of course there was a little bit of editing, moving points around and such. And down here, this is another example of reusing texture space. There's all these supports inside the guitar. There's 3 of them, these little pieces right in here, and they share the exact same texture space. So there's 1, 2, 3 of them, and they all share the exact same texture space. So yeah, just another example of that. So yeah, I think that's probably a good example of how to unwrap a complicated object. It's basically just one piece at a time. You know, in the video, I believe we unwrap the front face of the body, and then the inside face, and then the edges, and then the sides of the body, and then maybe the bridge, and then the fretboard, and then the neck, and whatever. And maybe I could do a video that basically goes over that, but it's quite a long process. I mean, I think it's like a 4 or 5 hour video in itself, and I probably spent a good 4 or 5 days just on the project alone. But you can see in the end, obviously, you get a I don't know how to make it. You get a very beautiful result in the end. So anyways, yeah, I'm gonna leave that off there. Hopefully that gives you some more ideas and techniques to unwrapping more complex objects. It's all practice, watching some different tutorials. Again, obviously the paid ones, like the DVD I bought when I did this, obviously taught me a lot. But anyways, thanks for watching from the team here at BlenderTech.com. If you enjoyed this video and learned something, please like it. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos. We're now on Twitter at twitter.com/blender_tech and Facebook at facebook.com/BlenderTech page, all one word. If you dislike this video for some reason, don't just hit the thumbs down button and leave. Instead, ahead, leave a comment about what you did not like, or if it's private, email us at info@blendertech.com so that we can continually improve our videos based on your community input. We also take requests for tutorials and call for helps just like this video, so if you're having an issue with something and time permits and it's not too advanced, we can definitely put up a personal video for you, or if you want to see a tutorial and we have interest in it, we'll definitely make one up. So see you next time. Remember, create your way.